it's panic. Faced with the possible collapse of the American shield, Europe is faltering with under-equipped armies, aging arsenals and strained supply chains. In a few months, European defense has become a matter of survival again. Good evening, Xavier Titelman.
Good evening.
Tonight, Europeans no longer have a choice, and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is asking his partners to step up.
New countries
Of Europe
will
increase their
defense spending as announced by the
United Kingdom recently.
and other countries will
Follow suit.
we must also have a fair balance with
The United States. For the
defense. We know that if the security situation requires it, we will increase defense spending.
Xavier Titelman, same hobby for months, but is there really a European rebound?
Until now, we thought it would be nice, maybe. As a former soldier, we advocated for increasing military power and renamed the Ministry of Defense to the Ministry of the Armies, implying that defense was no longer the primary focus. France is the sole country that has maintained its relevance and permanence as evidenced by science and facts. To keep investing in defense and develop technologies despite our allies nearly sabotaging our efforts. Germany and Poland reject our attempts to create general staffs, insisting on American involvement and refusing to duplicate NATO structures. When we try, when others catch up, when the Germans invest, it's to buy American equipment, P-8s for maritime patrol, F-35s for their fighter planes. Even now, when they try to make efforts, it was never within a European framework. Right now, we no longer have a choice, but it's a reality. Until now, we were hoping, we were saying it might happen. Now, we know that next week, if we are attacked by the Russians, we are alone. And that's what really triggers the realization that these countries today, we can look them in the eyes. By saying that France has been right for 60 years.
Xavier Titelman, you say that France has continued, still lost some industries. Defense, we closed the powder factory, for example, on French territory. The Charles Clair was somewhat abandoned. So France was not entirely the most vehement country in terms of defense either.
Being the only one to be right means that in the end, we don't necessarily have the means to do everything correctly. Even now, when we discuss increasing power such as air defense, we understand the current need for a comprehensive ballistic air defense system. France, with Italy, with the Mamba health system, is the most relevant equipment. What do the Germans do when they know that indeed it is absolutely necessary to improve in this area? They ally with the Americans, with the Israelis, to develop a competing parallel system. So yes, we were right. Yes, absolutely. We should have had more resources from France, but we must also understand that we can't face this alone. That is to say, national French, if possible. That's what we did in deterrence. We decided to be totally autonomous, sovereign in deterrence. However, this choice cannot be made in all areas, so cooperation is needed. But when our allies are not able to establish cooperation, when they refuse it, or even sabotage our decisions, obviously, we can't be sovereign in every domain.
The French Minister of the Armed Forces acknowledges a delay, but the question is, can we really catch up on this delay? Listen.
We will be at the rendezvous. We are significantly rearming and investing a lot of money, and will likely invest even more in the future.
But there is no question on this segment of falling behind after the delay that may have been taken in the past.
My goal is not to catch up with this delay, which would be in vain. It's to leap a technological generation and precisely flirt with the future.
Leap a technological generation. Do you already agree with that? Are there really efforts that are in vain because we've fallen too far behind? Or should we invest massively in what, in your opinion, should we invest massively, quite simply?
The reality is, today we have very efficient equipment, but not enough of it. Looking at Ukraine, it's a bit the opposite. It has the mass, but not the cutting-edge elements that would allow it to win the war. If we gave Ukraine equipment like the Rafale, etc., indeed, that would allow Ukraine to win. That is, we are not able to hold on because we don't have the low cost. How would we intercept 2,500 cruise missiles a month like the Ukrainians do? We don't know how to do it because we don't know how to make it low cost. So the first point for me is to succeed in massively moving up in the low cost.
How do you explain the fact that we can't manage to do low cost?
Because first of all, we do not accept to lower ourselves to make systems that are not expensive. We absolutely want to always have overqualified systems. Our teleoperated ammunition and kamikaze drones cost 20,000 euros, while Ukrainian drones only cost 300 euros. We prohibited ourselves from making optical fiber. In hindsight, it was the right decision as it allowed us to focus on other parallel projects. So it's simply also that we took a lot of time to understand that high-intensity warfare was a reality, was a possibility. And the feedback we have on Ukraine makes that today we are industrializing equipment that is adapted to this high-intensity warfare. We worked on improving the ammunition, shells and cannons for the Caesar artillery system. So there are areas in which we have given ourselves the means to increase in speed, rhythm and power. And so we are now ready to prepare for a potential open war with Russia in 2 or 3 years.
2 or 3 years, you say?
That's the official plan presented by the German intelligence services to the Bundestag, in which they said that if the Russians get 2 to 3 years to cease fire with Ukraine and lift the sanctions, they will continue to recruit 800,000 men over 3 years, and they will start producing thousands of armored vehicles per year again. So that means that after 3 years, we end up with a Russian army that has 800,000 men, thousands of armored vehicles, and tens of thousands of missiles that it would be capable of firing in a salvo.
Are we able, on the European side, to make up for our delay within 2 or 3 years?
Unfortunately, we have not made all the necessary efforts in all areas to achieve it. Now, once again, it is easier to be able to defend than to attack. Our aim is not to attack Russia, but to withstand an assault. Ukraine, with its 500,000 to 600,000 troops, has the ability to stop Russia from dominating the country. Russia, an imperialist country, follows through on its declared intentions regardless. The modification of borders and the reintegration of the Baltic countries mean we must be ready. We plan to put 3 brigades in the Baltic countries, for example. Obviously, we would need to be much more numerous. That is to say, we would obviously need to have thousands of men who would be present on the ground, capable of being reinforced very quickly. I participated in exercises like PICNE, which we sent, and I was very proud. We sent hundreds of additional commando paratroopers into the area in 1 day, just to show our ability to ramp up very quickly. The Baltic countries have had years to prepare a robust defense, including trenches, to obstruct Russian advances. But that means yes in the face of this gigantic Russian mass, and who will develop if we lift the sanctions and they have a ceasefire. If we fail to increase industrial production to offset the American withdrawal, it's a certainty. If we don't prepare for this war, it will happen
concretely in the immediate. Xavier Teitelman, we know that the Ukrainians have been trained on certain weapons, American, for example, the Patriots, which are not European production weapons. What do we do if tomorrow Donald Trump, as he hinted through his White House spokesperson, stops aid to Ukraine? These weapons, which need what is called MCO, operational readiness, which are in the hands of the Ukrainians. Can we replace that? Are we able to do it?
The Patriots you mentioned were supplied by the Netherlands and Germany, depending on the provider. There are even countries like Japan that have indirectly provided missiles for Ukraine's use. So it's important to understand that this is a global issue. Even the F-16s, you look at Venezuela, which still has its F-16s flying after 10 years of embargo. So spare parts, we can still have a secondary market, we can organize ourselves. Ukraine, while possessing American equipment, also has gear frequently originating from Europe. Whether it's these missile launches, the AIMARS, whether it's the fighter jets, whether it's the tanks, in the end, it's maybe American equipment, like, for example, the Abrams tanks, but there's also Australia, which provided 50 Abrams tanks. Even if the logistical support chain for Ukraine were to disappear, the Ukrainians are not alone on the United States side. The situation would be easier than a year ago, when the United States had completely halted aid to Ukraine for half a year. Because at that time, indeed, they had less equipment, Europe had not yet ramped up. Whereas today, there is more production of ships. At that time, there is more transfer of material, and they are better armed than a year ago. Today, the disappearance of the Americans scares the Ukrainians less than what they suffered a year ago.
The real question that arises tonight is how to have security guarantees for Ukraine. And that was at the heart of the discussions at Downing Street in London.
We are going to develop
a cooperation to defend
an agreement in Ukraine to guarantee peace. The United Kingdom is ready to
launch into it
with
troops
and an air defense
to Europe,
to defend peace on our
continent, and
to make the greatest efforts. But for this to succeed, we need the support of the
United States. We
work with the United States. After my meeting with President Trump
last week
agreed. Indeed, we want lasting peace, and we now need to
get results together. What do Ukrainians need? Because if we believe the spokesperson for the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry, he says very clearly, in addition to the troops we will talk about in a moment, peacekeeping troops, we will also need to secure the sky and the sea, especially the Black Sea. How can we do it without the Americans if peace is organized in the coming weeks, for example?
Well, we are already able to do it today in part. That is to say, we could have made the decision 2 years ago to put French air defense batteries in Odessa, to protect civilians and save hundreds of lives without engaging in war with Russia by only intercepting missiles aimed at civilian targets. So, already making ourselves available to international law by preventing massacres, etc., it's something that can be done right away. It frees up a lot of maneuvers, it frees up Ukrainian soldiers who will be available and air defense that would be available to go to the front, to intercept Russian helicopters, fighter jets and bombers. So today, yes, we are not alone, capable of entering Ukraine and occupying the country in the sense of protecting it from a possible future Russian invasion. Because if we imagine a ceasefire on the front line in the context of a return to normal, today Ukraine will be unable to sustain an army of 500,000 to 600,000 soldiers. The men can return to work, but they can ramp up rapidly if needed. Imagine a Ukrainian army of 200,000 men with 30 to 40,000 Europeans available on the ground as a second line, a bit like the Americans in South Korea, who would be able, in case of Russian aggression, to go back in support to prevent an offensive, as the Ukrainians were able to absorb it in Kharkiv last April. We can imagine an organization in which, yes, we will do less well alone than with the Americans. However, we currently possess aircraft that can guarantee Ukraine's air superiority to prevent new missile salvos. We can set up ground air defense and deploy personnel as part of an organized ceasefire. While weaker without American presence, we should not consider ourselves alone. Turkey, Canada, France and Great Britain said they were ready, with Turkey offering 300,000 men. Many European countries like the Netherlands are capable of participating in this society.
And many also say, Xavier Titelman, and you know better than me that it's premature. Even today, in the columns of La Tribune, the Spanish foreign minister says that it's premature. The Poles have said that it's premature. Very clearly, there is a reluctance on the part of some European countries to join this effort. Some European countries fail to realize that their own borders are at risk in this conflict.
Several countries, including Spain, Portugal and Italy, are on the front line and highly aware of the situation. They are not directly involved in this conflict, but they understand well that we are in a unique Europe. We have defense agreements in partnership with Ukraine, the same order of man from Budapest, NATO and the European Union. So all this means that we are still with direct allies and a country that openly threatens us. Russia has organized attacks on European soil, including France. Fortunately, these were failures. Attempts to blow up planes, fortunately, these were failures. Assassins. Targeting, explosions of ammunition stocks, destruction of factories in Germany and Bulgaria. All this is a reality. Russia is destroying our infrastructures. All this today, anyone who does not realize it is deliberately closing their eyes. So, based on this principle, yes, there are countries that do not understand the urgency of imposing themselves very quickly. But we want peace, we want a quick peace. In the absence of being able to offer a clear, definitive victory to Ukraine, which would put an end to Russian imperialism, in the same way that French imperialism stopped with Dien Bien Phu and the Algerian War, a real Ukrainian victory would be needed to stop Russian imperialism. Unfortunately, we are not giving the Ukrainians the means to achieve this victory. So, a deterrent force is needed that is sufficient to achieve a ceasefire. We are deploying men in Ukraine behind the front, once again on Belarus, for air defense. This means the Ukrainians have a variety of maneuvers to convey to the Russians that they will never capture Donbass, as currently the Russians are unable to make further progress. And secondly, this mass of maneuvers guarantees a no return of the war. Ultimately, whether Ukraine joins NATO or not is secondary, as it will have enough deterrent force to prevent Russia from attacking again.
The Russians, you say, are not gaining ground. The events in Pokrovsk are crucial as they concern peace on these plateaus. But the Ukrainians continue to fight against the Russians. You've just returned from Ukraine, Xavier Titelman, I must say, since you were on the ground. Very concretely, what is happening on that side?
I visited Pokrovsk in August, October, December, and 2 weeks ago. So I've really been in contact with the soldiers, and I've seen the evolution of their feelings. First thing, starting from February, the gliding bombs, the famous Russian gliding bombs that caused so much suffering to the Ukrainians, they are now jammed. That is, when the Russians launch gliding bombs, they don't fall on the bunker or trench, as in the past they fall a bit randomly. The Russians are evolving. When they hit the city, even if it's 328 yards away, it still destroys a building. So now they can no longer target military infrastructures and protection centers, meaning they attack civilians as they usually do. That's the first point. The Russian attack no longer allows as much to undermine the Ukrainian defense. Second point, the famous 155th Brigade Anne de Kiev, which was formed in France, which arrived from January in the south of the Pokrovsk zone. When she arrived with her 18 Caesar cannons, her 20, and 1 Leopard tanks, German, the front stopped moving even for the past 2 weeks. Ukrainians are regaining some ground around Pokrovsk in a local offensive. Militarily, I haven't felt the Ukrainian military as serene as this for at least a year and a half. They have the ammunition, they have the equipment, they are no longer retreating. The Russian rate of progress slows down each month, month after month, since November. So they all felt like we were on the verge of ending the Russian aggression. The Russians are no longer advancing militarily. They are retreating in Toretsk today and Pokrovsky yesterday. The Russian economy is on the brink of bankruptcy. Ultimately, we are regressing because of the Americans. Militarily, they are on too.
But what you're telling us, Xavier Titelman, is that we should give the Ukrainians more time to try to recover some territories.
We should not assume that the Ukrainians can significantly liberate their territory. However, we need to make Russia understand that given the prospects of equipment arriving in Ukraine, it is impossible for Russia to conquer, not even Donbass. At the current speed, it's almost 3 years to take Donbass. They have no chance of taking the 4 oblasts they officially annexed, Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. It will never happen. But if we continue to make atheists to myself to help them halfway, and that eventually the Russians manage to take a third of a department in a year, that's what they took in 2024, a third of a French department. They may believe Ukrainians will ultimately collapse, so they will persist. If the prospects are clear, by the end of next year, they will have an additional 500 armored vehicles and 100 more fighter planes. There, the Russians are sure it's futile to keep exhausting themselves and must stop. But the big fear today is not even the disappearance of American armament. It would potentially be the end of sanctions. Because if the Russians have money again, because they can export freely, easily, and at the same time the Americans start to close off the equipment they lack to produce their armaments, chips, optical systems, etc. There, it will be worse than the disappearance of American aid. So what scares Ukrainians today is really the end of sanctions on Russia. Instead of receiving 2,500 missiles monthly, they might be getting 5,000 each month. And then, however, they wouldn't be able to hold on.
But, as you know, Xavier Titelman, Emmanuel Macron said it himself, this massive funding that they are certainly going to implement next Thursday during the European Council meeting. This massive funding probably corresponds to hundreds of billions of euros. That's why in the short term, we must do everything to keep American support. And that, when we see that, after all, we tell ourselves that we are not able to give the Ukrainians an immediate deterrent force since the Americans have abandoned Ukraine in front of the world's cameras.
It's not about giving hundreds of billions, it's about having them. Moreover, it's Keynesian. We invest in the French national defense tool to create local jobs, to be able to provide equipment to the Ukrainians. Behind, like the Americans, 80% of their expenses are for purchasing American equipment that will reach Ukraine in the coming years. It's exactly the same concept. We are strengthening our defense, it's an investment, but in the same way that there were billions and hundreds of billions that were poured into the COVID crisis at the time. We also have European funds that can potentially be unlocked, European loans, the issuance of European debt to be able to face this threat. It should be understood as an investment. It may cost hundreds of billions, but it will prevent trillions in destruction if the Russians attack in the next few years. Today we are making an investment. Yes, an investment. It can be expensive, but if it saves lives and leads to even greater savings, it will clearly be profitable.
I want to hear from you, Xavier Stolman, on the United States and their aid, because their aid, it has been at the level of weapons, at the humanitarian level as well, but especially at the level of intelligence. Intelligence is essential, especially for having lasting peace and guaranteeing it. We know that, for example, the French, we would have needed the Americans in Africa for intelligence. Could we do without the Americans there?
So at the beginning of the war, it is clear that American support in the field, especially with the deployment of airborne warning and control system planes and electronic warfare planes like the E-8, G-Star greatly enabled the Ukrainians to hold and target correctly. Now, it must be clear the targeting with American help has greatly reduced today, because in the end, what are they going to hit, the Ukrainians? In depth, it's going to be the refineries, the ammunition stocks that we still know. The Ukrainians are familiar with many targets because they were part of the Soviet Union, the headquarters. Ultimately, we know that it is the Ukrainians who know them themselves. So yes, the Americans have a support capacity in the field, which is absolutely gigantic. We must not believe that we are worthless or that the English and Germans are absent. They even have radar satellites to see through clouds. We really have a European coordination that is very, very strong. And the Ukrainians, today, they have networks of informants who are still very, very well informed. It is their information that often also allows us to go find generals in Russia. They are the ones who killed, for example, the head of the nuclear, radiological, biological, chemical, or strategic bombers by organizing attacks right in the heart of Moscow. Clearly, having Americans present is always preferable. When they're not trying to mislead us, like they did with the war in Iraq, when they were giving us false information to make us believe that we needed to attack. Well, the Americans today, we have to accept the fact that they failed to do without it as late as possible. They give us 10 years to prepare a NATO without the Americans, which would be much better. We must be prepared to act swiftly if they abandon Ukraine and Europe tomorrow. We have to face this reality.
Thank you very much.
Xavier Stelman.
In a few months, European defense has become a matter of survival again. Can we really do without the Americans? You heard it with Xavier Stelman. We'll talk about it in a moment.